Purchase Media.
A 16-year-old girl lives across the street from the courthouse that could have saved her life. For years, she tells her teachers, her friends, her neighbors, and her school counselor that she is being chained to her bed at night, beaten, and starved.
CPS is called numerous times for over a decade, and every single time, nothing happens. So her parents pull her out of school and start homeschooling her, which really just means no one is coming to check on her anymore.
On February 27, 2008, a fire breaks out in a small house in Centreville, Michigan. The girl's stepmother escapes with burns on her hands and face. The girl does not escape because she is chained to her bunk bed by a dog choke chain fitted around her waist.
Today we're talking about Calista Springer, a girl who loved to draw, who had a unique giggle, who tried to get someone to help her for years and years and years. We're also talking about the parents who tortured her, the caseworkers who looked away, and a system that failed her at every single turn.
We normally don't give warnings at the beginning of our episodes, but because this one involves abuse of a child, I want to give you a heads up that this case is extremely sad and the details are brutal. So please take care while listening. I'm Gina.
And I'm Amber, and this is Weird True Crime. Before we get into what happened, let's begin with who Calista was. Calista Marie Springer was born on May 22, 1991 in Sturgis, Michigan, to a man named Anthony and a woman named Norma.
According to Anthony, Norma was neglectful, so he took Calista and left. He eventually met a woman named Marsha Ann, and together they had two daughters, Courtney, born in 1994, and Heather, born in 1996. In May of 1997, Anthony was awarded full custody of Calista, and Marsha formally adopted her. So from the time Calista was about 6 years old, Marsha was her mom.
According to her obituary, Calista loved to draw, paint, and color. She loved watching TV, and she will always be remembered for, quote, her unique giggle while having fun, end quote. That's what her family put in her obituary. Her giggle. I keep coming back to that.
And I want to say it is kind of sad, though, because her obituary is very short, and that's literally all the information that's in it. So it just goes to show you how much she was thought of. In 2000, when Calista was 8 years old, she was diagnosed with a pervasive developmental disorder, or PDD, by a psychologist named Dr. Jeffrey Kaler. PDD refers to a group of disorders characterized by delays in the development of socialization and communication skills. Symptoms can include difficulty with language, difficulty relating to people and events, unusual reactions to sensory information, and repetitive behaviors. Children with PDD vary widely in their abilities. Some have significant challenges, and some have relatively normal language development. But what they all need is care, support, and structure.
Dr. Kaler told the Springers that Calista needed 24-hour supervision. According to court documents, the implication was that Calista almost needed to be in an institutional setting to receive the level of supervision required to keep her safe. And the Springers took that and twisted it. They interpreted 24-hour supervision to mean Calista should be physically restrained. That is not what it means. That is not what any medical professional means when they say a child needs supervision. But that framing became the foundation of every excuse they made for the next 8 years.
Also, in 1997, a therapist told the Springers that Calista, quote, may never develop judgment and impulse control, end quote. The Springers would later use that, too, as justification. Every time someone questioned them, they had a doctor's quote ready. And every time someone raised an alarm, they had a report to point to. They built a paper trail of medical language around a child they were torturing.
Here's the thing. People were raising alarms about Calista almost from the time she came to live with Anthony and Marsha. In 1995, when she was just 3 years old, 2 complaints were filed with CPS reporting that Calista had extremely high levels of lead in her blood, and that the Springers were not responding to the recommended preventative treatment for the lead poisoning.
In January 1997, Callista's biological mother, Norma, came back into the picture and sought custody, alleging that Calista was malnourished and had been abused. Anthony denied everything and moved to terminate Norma's parental rights. The judge sided with Anthony and awarded him full custody in May of 1997. The same month, Marsha adopted Calista, so the door on that potential escape route closed.
Also in 1997, Callista's aunt, Valerie Springer, went to the police. On May 5th, Valerie reported that Calista had a bloody lip after Anthony hit her in the face. Marsha confirmed that one. And then on June 8th, Valerie reported again. This time, Calista had untreated second-degree burns on her thumb and ring finger. The burns had become infected because they were left untreated. Valerie also reported that Marsha had hit Calista in the face and given her a bloody nose. The reason? Calista had stuck her tongue out.
A bloody nose for sticking out her tongue. She was 6 years old. What 6-year-old hasn't stuck their tongue out at a parent for one reason or another?
That same year, other relatives also went to the police to report they believed Calista was being abused. Multiple people from multiple directions, all trying to sound the alarm at the same time, and yet nothing happened.
Now, let me tell you a little bit about Anthony Springer. Around this same period, 1997 and 1998, Marsha's own picture of him became deeply disturbing. He bounced from job to job and spent what little money the family had on collections of model airplanes and Civil War memorabilia. He also had a hobby of collecting roadkill, boiling the meat off the bones, and reconstructing the animals' skeletons. Marsha later wrote that this had become an obsession with him and that you couldn't have a conversation with him unless it was about that subject.
In 1997, he put his hand through a plate glass window. In 1998, he ripped a phone from the wall during an argument about, get ready for this, the placement of a Christmas tree. In June 1999, Marsha filed a personal protection order against him, stating that he was prone to fits of rage and violence, often throwing objects and punching walls and doors. She described the home as an atmosphere of anger and rage. She wrote that he threatened her at times and took out his anger on their 3 young daughters. Her exact words, quote, "Tony never has a kind word to say to the girls and has never told them that he loves them. It's just constant yelling to shut up, get out of my way, and get out of my sight." End quote.
She also wrote that Anthony suffered from bipolar disorder, attention deficit disorder, and severe depression, and that he rarely took his Prozac and Ritalin and didn't see any need for counseling.
The protection order was granted, and then, 2 months later, Marsha had it terminated at her own request. She wrote that there had been no problems, that they were in counseling, and that the counselor felt they both needed to be involved with the children. And just like that, they went right back to the way it was.
Which means the woman who later claimed she loved Calista like her own daughter spent years in a home she herself described as violent, rageful, and dangerous, and then chose to stay. Now, it's easy to place judgment, but you have to remember that it is extremely hard to leave an abusive relationship, especially when there are children involved. We don't know what Anthony said to Marsha, what he did or threatened to do that made her decide to stay.
While all of this was going on with the adults, Calista was telling people what was happening to her. In elementary school, she told her friends and teachers that she was beaten, chained to the bed at night, and made to use a bucket instead of a bathroom.
In May 1999, a social worker named David Wingard, who was part of a wraparound program specifically designed to help youth with severe emotional and behavioral problems, reported that Calista was being restrained to her bed, to a chair, or to a pole in the kitchen with a belt or ropes. According to M Live, she was kept on a cot with no sheets or blankets.
So, 8-year-old Callista is being forced to sleep on a bare cot in a family home where her two younger sisters have beds, blankets, pillows, and probably a stuffed animal or two.
In 1999 and 2000, a community mental health worker named Dorothy Bruick worked directly with Callista in the home. She noticed a sliding bolt lock on the outside of Callista's bedroom door. Marsha told her it was a safety measure to prevent Callista from hurting family members and wandering at night.
Dorothy said she never once witnessed Callista be violent. In fact, Callista was always quiet and reserved around her. And Dorothy said something that has stayed with me. Quote, I never saw Marsha touch Callista in a nurturing way. End quote.
In May 2000, school counselor Deb Mathis filed a report with CPS. Callista had a bruise on her cheek and said her father had kicked her in the stomach. Deb also reported that Callista said she was locked in her bedroom at night, which meant she was forced to wet the bed.
In September 2000, Deb Mathis filed again, stating the same thing. Callista was being locked in her room at night.
And then, in August of 2001, CBS received an anonymous report stating that Callista was being mentally abused. According to the report, Marsha was telling Callista she would put her in foster care when she turned 12, but that she hoped Callista would die before then.
Let that sink in for a second. Marsha Springer, Callista's adoptive mother, hoped that her daughter would die.
According to court documents, CPS declined to take action on all of these reports. In most cases, workers made follow-up phone calls or visits, said they found no evidence of harm, and sent a letter to whoever had complained, telling them the case was closed, over and over and over again.
In 2003, the family moved to Centreville, a small town about 35 miles south of Kalamazoo, Michigan. They lived on the 100 block of West Burr Oak Street in downtown Centreville in a house directly across the street from the courthouse.
This becomes one of the most haunting details of this whole story. The building that could have saved Callista's life was visible from her bedroom window.
Callista was in 4th grade when they moved, and school officials noticed things almost immediately. She wore long-sleeve shirts and turtlenecks, even in hot weather. It wasn't enough to hide the bruises on what the Detroit News described as her frail body. She was forced to wear the same clothes for days, sometimes weeks at a time. She wasn't allowed to use a toothbrush, soap, or shampoo. School aides actually kept those items on hand at school so Callista could use them there, in private, where her parents couldn't stop her.
And Callista was still trying to get help. She was telling anyone who would listen. In 2004, she went to a classmate's house after school and told her friend's mother, a woman named Sue, what was happening. Sue called CPS immediately.
Sue told M Live, quote, I didn't see any handicap but fear and hunger. I wanted to put food in her backpack when she went home. She said she couldn't take a banana because she couldn't hide the peel. So she took an apple because she said she could eat the core. End quote. Calista took the apple and ate the core so her parents would know she'd been given food.
She was a 4th grader, figuring out how to hide the evidence of having eaten. Let that land for a second.
Sue said Calista was eating like she was absolutely starved, that she was spilling her guts trying to get out as much information as she could. Sue told M Live it sounded completely horrific.
This is no surprise, but CPS did very little with Sue's report. So Sue went further. She contacted U.S. Representative Fred Upton directly about Calista. She wrote to his office, quote, "Someone needs to help her. Does she need to die before anyone listens?" End quote.
Upton's office contacted DHS. DHS told them that Calista suffered from pica, a tendency to eat non-food substances, and that most of the complaints they received centered on Callista's behavior caused by her condition and her parents' efforts to control her.
They said they believed Calista was being cared for adequately and that if any new allegations of abuse or neglect were received, they would investigate. Upton took them at their word and dropped it.
She couldn't take the banana because she couldn't hide the peel, and the government's response was, her parents are doing their best.
On October 29th, 2004, two more reports came in on the same day. Callista's teacher reported that Calista was being chained to her bed at night, and a neighbor named Beth Granger reported that Calista had told her she was being chained, hadn't eaten anything except at school for 2 days, that Marsha wouldn't let her use toothpaste or deodorant, and that Marsha was physically abusive.
Then on November 8th, Callista's teacher filed again. This time, Calista had a black eye. She told her teacher that Marsha had forced her to lie on the ground, grabbed her head by the hair, pulled it up, and then let it drop back to the ground.
Unlike every single previous complaint made the decade plus before these reports were assigned to CPS investigator Patricia Skelding.
Skelding interviewed Calista at school, and Calista told her everything. She said Marsha would hit her, pull her hair, and be mean when no one was around. Skelding noted in her own report that Calista was adamant about the hair pulling. She repeated it multiple times, and Calista made a specific, direct request. She asked Skelding to please convince her parents that restraining her at night was no longer necessary.
She wasn't just describing abuse, she was making a case for herself. She was asking a CPS investigator, clearly, specifically, and directly, for help. She knew what she wanted. She was trying to negotiate her own safety.
Skelding also interviewed the sisters, Courtney and Heather, at school. They said they had never seen Marsha hit Calista, pull her hair, or be mean to her in any way. They described their mother as very patient with Calista, but they did admit that Marsha chained Calista to bed at night.
You have to remember, Calista is saying that Marsha is only treating her this way when no one else is around to witness it.
Yep.
Skelding also consulted a CPS worker named Sheila Schill, who had background knowledge of the prior complaints about the Springers. And then her final interview was with Marsha and Anthony on November 9th.
The Springers told Skelding that Calista was a known liar, that she made up stories and nothing she said could be believed. Anthony said the device they used to tie Calista in bed was the same kind used in adult nursing homes to alert staff when patients get up and wander. Skelding warned them about fire safety. She did not investigate the chains.
She warned them about fire safety. She saw a child being chained to a bed, and her response was to mention fire safety. And then she concluded there was insufficient evidence of abuse or neglect.
But here's what Skelding wrote in her own report. She wrote that she was, quote, very uncomfortable with the way Calista is being treated and targeted, end quote. She tried to convince Marsha to let Calista have a toothbrush and toothpaste under supervision. Marsha said no. Then Skelding wrote, quote, Calista is known to make up stories and she is not credible. It ends up that it is her word against Marsha's word, end quote.
And in the same report, Skelding also wrote that she did not think Calista made up the story about Marsha pulling her head up by the hair. She believed that part. She wrote it down. And then she still closed the case.
And then Skelding added a handwritten note to the very end of the report. She wrote, quote, Calista is a vulnerable child. Because she is not believable or credible, she would also be an easy target to abuse. I think we need to check out all complaints regarding her, end quote.
Skelding understood that the very reason no one believed Calista made her easier to abuse. She wrote that down. And then her supervisor, Cynthia Bear, agreed that there was insufficient evidence and closed the case.
The Office of Children's Ombudsman, an independent watchdog agency, later found that Skelding and Bear failed to properly investigate the allegations against the Springers. The OCO criticized CPS for not properly handling complaints of child abuse against the Springers for the previous 11 years.
On June 3rd, 2005, another mother, Deb Stauffer, whose child was in Callista's class, reported that Calista had told her she was being chained to her bed, was forced to wear the same clothes for days, and was sometimes hit with a board as punishment. Supervisor Cynthia Bear wrote to a school counselor about the allegations. The counselor said it was the same old story. Calista was just seeking attention. Bear declined to investigate.
According to court documents, that was the last complaint ever made to CPS about Calista Springer.
And shortly after that, the Springers pulled Calista out of public school. They announced they were homeschooling her.
Michigan, at the time, had some of the most permissive homeschool laws in the country. To homeschool your child, you didn't have to give a reason. You didn't have to notify the public school. There were no instruction time requirements, no curriculum standards, no minimum education level for the so-called teacher, and no testing. And critically, the state was not allowed to collect data on homeschooled students, which meant there was no way to track what was happening to them.
You probably won't be surprised to learn that the Springers were not teaching Calista anything. When investigators later searched the house, they found no homeschool books or workbooks. In fact, there were no educational materials of any kind. They had simply removed Calista from the one place where adults were regularly seeing her, noticing things, and making calls, and then locked her away where no one could reach her.
While her sisters went to school every day, Calista stayed home, chained. The prosecutor later said, quote, "She could have looked out her bedroom window at the courtroom that could have saved her life. She's a tragic example of how the system can be exploited," end quote. When investigators began talking to people who knew the Springers after the fire, they got a picture of daily life in that house that is almost impossible to process.
I'm going to try my best to get through this without crying or getting too upset. Calista was forced to stand or sit inside a square marked by tape on the living room floor. As she stepped outside it, she was made to stand with her nose pressed against a piece of tape on the wall, sometimes on her tiptoes to reach it, sometimes for more than an hour.
She ate dinner sitting on the floor and was given small portions. One person who knew the family told investigators she was treated lower than the animals.
She was rarely allowed outside. When she was, she often had to sit on the front porch with her head between her knees while her sisters and the neighborhood kids played nearby. She could hear them, she just couldn't join them.
Her teachers described a pretty normal girl, a girl who could read and write, who tried hard in class, and who made friends. She struggled a bit academically, but was engaged and eager. On the other hand, her parents described an uncontrollable, violent, dangerous child who needed to be physically restrained for everyone's safety. Those two descriptions do not sound like they belong to the same person.
What's particularly striking is that every person from outside that home, teachers, neighbors, social workers, friends, described Calista as pleasant, quiet, and trying her best. The danger, violence, and uncontrollability, that was only ever described by the Springers. If Calista was struggling with the intense behavioral issues her parents described, wouldn't you see those same behaviors at school? Just after 8:30 in the morning on February 27th, 2008, Marsha and Calista were home alone in the house on West Burr Oak Street. Anthony had already left, and Callista's sisters were at school.
In Marsha's account of that morning's events, she was vacuuming when she smelled smoke. She stopped the vacuum, and the smell went away. She started it back up and smelled smoke again. She turned it off and went to the kitchen. When she came back to the living room, she found flames where she had set down the vacuum. She went back to the kitchen for the fire extinguisher, but couldn't remove the safety pin. By then, the fire was too strong, so she fled. She told at least one person separately that she also tried throwing a pitcher of water on the flames and that the vacuum blew up in her face.
When firefighters arrived, Marsha told them Calista was upstairs in her bedroom, restrained to the bed because of special needs. In the ambulance, she described it as a fabric strap. What investigators found was a dog choke chain.
Calista was on a bunk bed in the second floor bedroom she shared with her sisters. The chain was 1/2 inch wide and 2 feet long. It was fitted around her waist and attached to the bed frame with plastic zip ties. The distance between her waist and the bed frame was about 9 to 10 inches. Detective Lieutenant John Slank told MLive, quote, "I firmly believe that she was tethered in that manner longer than 3 days," end quote. Just like her cot, the bed had no sheets, no blankets, no pillow.
The fire stayed on the first floor. The flames spread rapidly, but they never reached the second floor. Only the smoke did. The smoke went up the stairs, went into that bedroom, and Calista breathed it in. She breathed it in because she could not move away from it. She was 9 to 10 inches from the bed.
Marsha was able to exit the house with burns on her hands and face.
They also did not find a fire extinguisher in the house.
The cause of the fire was later determined to be a faulty vacuum. Investigators said they found nothing suspicious about the fire itself. This was not an arson case. Calista died because a vacuum caught fire and she couldn't get away from the smoke.
In a follow-up interview with law enforcement, Marsha said she was the only one who disconnected the chain from Calista every morning. Her described routine: get Calista's sisters up and ready for school, sit down for her coffee and let Calista catch up on her sleep, and then use a pair of needle-nose pliers to free Calista from the bed. After that, the two of them would spend their mornings sewing.
Oh, how wholesome. Needle-nose pliers to free her stepdaughter from the zip-tied chain around her waist every morning before sewing.
I know, right? Like, what a load of shit.
I can't.
Marsha also told investigators the choke chain was relatively new. She said they'd previously used a lock on the bedroom door and then a bed alarm, a strap around Calista's waist connected to an alarm on the side of the bed that would go off if she got up. She said the alarm had broken a few days before the fire and they were waiting on parts to fix it. In the meantime, they made the chain. Before the alarm, she said they tried baby monitors, rubber bands, and twisty ties.
Investigators tested the alarm system. It was working. It had not broken.
Marsha also told investigators that Calista engaged in self-mutilating behavior and harmed animals, that she couldn't be trusted at night because she rarely slept and would get into dangerous objects, razors, knives, and medications. That is why, Marsha said, the chain was necessary.
At some point after the fire, Marsha went to the home of Dr. Kaler, the psychologist who had diagnosed Calista with PDD back in 2000. Marsha claimed that Dr. Kaler had called Calista a child from hell and told Marsha she was a saint for taking care of her.
Calista's cause of death was asphyxiation from carbon monoxide poisoning. The medical examiner knew she was alive during the fire because her airway was black with soot all the way down. She breathed in the smoke. She was conscious, and she had indentations on her abdomen from the chain. Calista Springer was 16 years old. She weighed 91 pounds.
This kind of makes me happy. The Springers lost custody of their biological daughters following the fire.
On December 1st, 2008, Marsha and Anthony were both charged with manslaughter and first-degree child abuse, facing up to 15 years in prison.
But then in January 2009, a new county prosecutor took over, and he thought those charges were nowhere near enough. He upgraded them. The Springers were now facing felony murder, torture, and first-degree child abuse. They were looking at life in prison. Thank God.
Mm-hmm. They were released on bond, and while out on bond, awaiting trial for Calista's death, they filed for custody of Heather and Courtney, who had been removed from their care. I'll just leave that there.
In late February 2009, Anthony released a 5-page statement to the court addressing all of the allegations against him and Marsha. He called Calista a compulsive liar who made up stories about being beaten, chained, and starved, and said that was precisely why they pulled her out of school, because she kept lying to people and trying to get help running away. He said she had several mental disabilities that required extremely close monitoring for her own safety. He also said there were documents in the house that would prove Calista was violent and had no fear of anything. One example, she was once found with razor blades in her mouth. That's why she had to be restrained, for her own safety.
I just want to note that kids, like small children, don't understand the dangers involved with doing things like that. That's not an issue with a mental disability. That's a kid not understanding how the world works and that things can hurt them. That doesn't mean she was a danger to herself.
That was a kid who had no teaching or guidance from the
Right.
people who were supposed to be nurturing and caring for her.
Exactly. He said Calista ate like a horse, but had a high metabolism. She weighed 91 pounds when she died. While it is true that a child can eat plenty and be underweight, this is caused by things like high activity levels or medical conditions that affect digestion, like Crohn's disease or hyperthyroidism. We know Calista wasn't getting a lot of activity if she was chained up and not allowed to run around with the other kids. And she didn't have a medical condition that would explain her low weight. So this explanation doesn't make much sense.
Anthony admitted that CPS had contacted them 4 or 5 times over the years, but he pointed out that the children had never been removed from the home, which is true, they hadn't been. He seemed to think that proved he had done nothing wrong. What it actually proved was that CPS had failed Calista.
He also said there was a witch hunt against him and Marsha, that DHS and police were, quote, building a bonfire and looking for people to throw on it, end quote. And he pushed back on the idea that Calista could have been rescued if she hadn't been chained. He said that claim didn't mean a damn thing because the heat was so hot, nothing could have saved her. His final word on his daughter's death? Get ready to get really mad. Quote, her disabilities finally caught up with her. Her parents could not protect her from everything. End quote.
What a load of, you know what. If Marsha cared about Calista at all, she would have tried to get her out of that room. She lied about getting a fire extinguisher. So what was she doing during that span of time? How far had the fire spread when she left the house? Anthony's statement is so damning. Quote, her parents could not protect her from everything, end quote. They didn't even protect her from themselves.
No. Isn't that just disgusting that he would basically blame her for her own death after the way they treated her entire life?
No, there's a word for that behavior, isn't there?
The trial was moved from St. Joseph County to Kalamazoo County and began in late January 2010. It was a joint trial with a jury of 8 women and 4 men. The jury also had the option of convicting on lesser second-degree murder charges. The prosecution's argument was direct. The Springers knew what could happen if you left a child chained to a bed in a burning house. They had even been warned about fire safety by CPS investigator Skelding back in 2004. They knew, and they chose to keep chaining her up anyway.
And they lied about how long the chain had been in use. Marsha said the chain was temporary and had only been used for a couple of days, and that Calista was released from the chain after Marsha enjoyed her morning coffee. However, the lieutenant on the scene said that she had been chained to that bed for more than 3 days.
The prosecution also zeroed in on the homeschooling piece. They said it was not a coincidence. They said homeschooling played a direct role in Callista's death because it allowed the Springers to eliminate everyone who could have reported the abuse. According to a 2024 report by the Coalition for Responsible Home Education, withdrawal from school to homeschool under suspicious circumstances is a red flag for abuse.
According to the report, CRHE researchers identified 59 cases in which families withdrew their children from school after an investigation had closed, or an indirect response to school officials making a report to social services. As of 2024, at least 31 homeschooled children have died from abuse after being withdrawn from school under suspicious circumstances.
And I just want to make an aside here. In no way are we saying this means parents who homeschool their children are abusive. I personally know several families who homeschool and their kids are happy, healthy, and thriving. This is a very rare exception, not the norm. I just have to make sure we include that in case we have any homeschool parents listening. We are not saying that you are abusive because you homeschool.
I've contemplated homeschooling my children with the current.
Yeah, and we are about 75% sure we will be homeschooling one of our kids next year. So just goes to show.
The defense position for both Springers was the same. They loved Calista. She was a special needs child who required 24-hour supervision. Everything they did to restrain her was to protect her from herself and from others. It was an accident. The fire killed her, and the fire was ruled accidental.
The defense also argued that Callista's issue stemmed from the neglect she suffered as an infant at the hands of her birth mother, Norma, essentially trying to place the origin of Callista's difficulties outside of their home and outside of their control.
The defense called a clinical child psychologist named Dr. Susan Carter, who testified that children with Callista's type of developmental disorders are sometimes described as energy vampires because they suck the energy from everybody. She testified that the disorder stems from a child's brain not developing properly, and that it is most often brought on by parental deprivation or neglect.
So, the defense called an expert who testified that the disorder their client used to justify chaining Callista up is most commonly caused by parental deprivation and neglect. I'm not sure that helped their case.
Dr. Carter also testified that children with the disorder often reject affection from family members, have trouble sleeping, struggle with lying and stealing, and can resort to self-mutilation and manipulation. She said, quote, "The lying is a form of manipulation, and as these children mature, they develop language-based skills to get their needs met. They're very good at getting people to feel sorry for them by making things up." End quote.
Under cross-examination, Dr. Carter admitted that she had never treated Callista, and when asked directly about using chains to restrain someone with PDD, she said the practice was inhumane and should be a last resort used only in an inpatient hospital setting. The defense's own expert said it was inhumane.
Anthony's defense attorney argued, quote, "Tony had his hands full with Calista. Mr. Springer went through a list of serious things that he saw Calista do. The word you're going to have to talk about is reasonable. Was he acting reasonably to protect her from her own behavior?" End quote.
If they were that concerned about her self-harming or harming others, she should have been put in an institution where she could have been taken care of properly.
Yep.
Instead of tying her to her bed. There's no excuse for the way this was handled. The defense also went after DHS directly. Attorney Bland said, and I'm quoting here, "If the Springers are going to be murderers, then this table ought to extend out another 6 feet and the DHS ought to be sitting here. Because if the Springers are culpable, tell me how DHS is any less culpable. Where was the caseworker? Where was Cindy Bear? They're sitting in their office, retiring, or whatever. And now the same state of Michigan that they work for wants you to convict Marsha Springer." End quote.
And that's not a crazy argument. DHS absolutely failed Calista, but DHS failing her does not mean the people who chained her to a bed are not responsible for what happened.
Callista's sister, Courtney, who was 16 at the time of the trial, testified that Callista was not treated any differently from her Heather. She said food was not withheld, that Callista could dress how she wanted. She said the chain was only used for 2 days before the fire.
She also said she was scared of her older sister and that Callista would get up in the middle of the night, sing and talk, and steal things. Anthony also testified that the restraint system in use at the time of the fire was a new combination that they'd only been testing for a few days.
I don't know that I would refer chaining a child to a bed as something you were testing.
Right. And what about that alarm system that was supposed to alert if she got up? According to the Springers, it was broken, but it worked just fine when investigators tried it. I guess the alarm needed more testing, too.
On February 23rd, 2010, after 9 days of deliberations, the jury came back. They found both Marsha and Anthony Springer guilty of torture and first-degree child abuse. They acquitted both Springers of felony murder.
On April 16th, they were sentenced. For the child abuse charges, Marsha received concurrent sentences of 95 months to 15 years. Anthony received 10 to 15 years. For torture, Marsha received 18 years and 9 months to 50 years. Anthony received 25 to 50 years in prison.
Anthony's torture sentence was significantly above the sentencing guidelines. His offense variable score was more than double the maximum on the applicable sentencing grid. The Court of Appeals later wrote that his score was, quote, attention grabbing, is of considerable worth, and does not exist in many criminal cases, end quote.
Both convictions and both sentences were affirmed on appeal.
After the criminal case, Callista's grandmother, Susan Langdon, filed a civil suit against CPS investigator Patricia Skelding and her supervisor, Cynthia Bear. Susan alleged that they had failed to adequately investigate the abuse reports and that Calista died as a result.
Skelding and Bear appealed the lawsuit on grounds of qualified immunity, meaning, as government employees acting within the scope of their authority, they argued they couldn't be held liable. But they conceded, for the purposes of the appeal, that a jury could reasonably find their conduct amounted to gross negligence.
The district court dismissed the lawsuit. In Michigan, CPS workers have qualified immunity, and because Skelding and Bear had not increased the abuse against Calista, they hadn't chained her up, they hadn't set the fire, they could not be held legally responsible for what happened to her 3 years after they last worked on her case.
The end of the district court's written decision included this line: the court was saddened by this case and is sympathetic to Susan's grievances. Indeed, CPS's handling of Calista Springer's case was less than exemplary, even considering the many inherent difficulties of CPS's mandate. End quote.
Susan appealed. The Michigan Court of Appeals ruled that the state had unfathomably failed to act, leaving Calista in the same perilous position she had always been in, no more and no less vulnerable. Because they hadn't made things actively worse, just failed to make them better, they were protected by immunity.
Callista's case wasn't the first time Michigan's Department of Human Services had failed a child. According to the South Bend Tribune, there had been at least 4 other recent high-profile cases around the same time, including deaths of children under foster or adoptive care.
And to put the scope of the CPS failure in context, the Detroit News reported that in 2007 alone, school officials filed more than 13,000 complaints of suspected abuse and neglect. That was more than 30% of all 40,000 plus complaints made to CPS that year. The system was overwhelmed. Children were being lost in it.
The deaths of Calista and the other children finally forced a reckoning. There was a public call for reform, In October of 2008, a federal judge ruled that Michigan's Department of Human Services had to improve a range of child welfare services, protective services, hotlines, investigations, housing, and healthcare. The stated goal was to reduce caseloads, which had been one of the central systemic failures all along.
As for homeschooling in Michigan, the laws remain largely unchanged, and Michigan is not alone. Here are some more studies for you. In 2014, a pediatrician at the University of Wisconsin named Dr. Barbara Knox studied school-age child torture victims and found that 47% had been withdrawn from school for homeschooling, and an additional 29% had never been enrolled at all. That means 76% of the child torture victims she studied had been kept out of school.
Researchers Rachel Coleman and Catherine Brightbill found that more than 40% of severe and fatal child abuse cases involved some form of imprisonment. The school is often the last line of defense. When that line is removed, deliberately, strategically, as the Springers did, there's nothing left.
Calista's case is not the only one like this. There was Liam Roberts in Illinois, Christian Choate in Indiana, Natalie Finn in Iowa. In each of these cases, homeschooling didn't cause the abuse, but it made the abuse invisible. And invisible abuse is almost impossible to stop.
The house on West Burr Oak Street in Centreville was demolished. The lot was turned into parking spaces for the courthouse across the street. Ironic, right? At the northeastern corner of the lot, there is a memorial garden.
Calista was, by every outside account, a completely normal kid who happened to be going through something no child should ever have to go through. She tried for years to get someone to listen to her and help. She told CPS investigators specifically what she needed, and the investigators didn't even make her parents give her a toothbrush.
She was a child screaming for help in every way a child knows how to scream, and the adults around her called it lying, called it attention-seeking, called it the same old story.
She wasn't seeking attention. She was seeking rescue. There's a difference. It's sad to say, but it doesn't surprise me that this ended this way. And I feel like we hear it all too often, that children in different types of abusive situations do reach out for help, do say that something is happening, and the adults around them tend to believe the other adults instead of the child.
Yep.
But also, how would a child of this age even know to tell someone that something like that is happening to them if they weren't actually experiencing it? Because they shouldn't even understand what that is or what it means.
No, at the age of when, this really truly started and she was screaming and crying for help, that's not something that a child innately knows.
No, I mean, she's 6, 7 years old telling people that these things are happening to her, and nobody believes her. Oh, she lies. I don't know. Maybe give her a little more credit than that.
Isn't it better to find out for sure and be wrong than, just that's all I can say.
There's not much to discuss when it comes to this, other than this is a horrible case and ended so tragically and could have obviously been handled in a much better way. So, just sucks.
If this case makes you want to do something, look into what your state's mandatory reporting laws say and what the homeschool regulations look like. If you work with children in any capacity, you're almost certainly a mandatory reporter. Know what that means. Use it. And if you see something, say something. Even if the child has a label. Even if the parents have a medical explanation. Even if the last 10 reports went nowhere. Say something anyway.
We'll link everything in the show notes. The court documents, the MLive investigative reporting, and the appellate decisions. The reporting on this case is thorough and heartbreaking, and we really encourage you to read it.
We want to give a big thank you to Haley Gray for her in-depth research on Calista's case. For those of you who don't know, Haley is one of the best victim advocates around and goes above and beyond to help families spread awareness about their loved ones.
She's also a top notch researcher and writer, and a fantastic human. If you enjoy the show, please take 2 minutes to leave us a 5-star rating and write us a nice review wherever you're listening. It helps other listeners like you discover our little corner of chaos, and it makes us smile.
Also, make sure to follow us on Instagram and TikTok at Weird True Crime so you can see the images for this episode. We also post funny reels and memes. It's a good time. Come back next week for something a little more lighthearted.
Until next time, stay safe.
And make good choices.
Bye.
Bye.